could you introduce yourself to netizens?
Hello, my name is Sobhna Poona, and I'm South African living in a beautiful seaside suburb on the Eastern Cape coast.
Okay. So since you said you're South African, my next question was going to be, what nationality are you? And you already built the cartoon. Now, what was growing up like for you?
Growing up, that's a volume in itself. I'm of mixed race parentage. My father was first generation in South Africa. His parents were both born in India. My mother was a first generation South Africa. Her mother was French and her father was an Englishman. My parents met when they were 8 and 14. So I was born during the height of the Group Areas Act, the Immorality Act, and of course, during the time of apartheid. So my parents couldn't live together because it was, of course, against the law. So I grew up with my French grandmother with many beautiful memories of growing up, learning French and English, spending lots of time in the kitchen with my grandmother, a very happy home with dogs and lots of people in and out, but not having early memories of my father because, of course, they were not allowed to be together.
Hmm. How do you love living with your grandma?
Sorry?
How did you love living with your grandma?
I love living with my grandmother. She was fondly called Oma, and all my earliest happy memories revolve around my Oma. I remember we used to take long bus trips. We'd start at the bus depot, sit on the bus all the way along all the different stops. We'd do the entire route, come to the end of that route, sit and have a picnic on the bus, and then sit on the bus all the way back home and spend several hours just sitting on a bus looking at the world as we passed street by street. It was a strange experience at some point because my grandmother used to take me shopping. And I have this distinct memory of the English market, the old English market. It had two entrances, one that said whites only, and the other for everyone else. And going shopping with my grandmother, we'd come into this entrance where it was whites only. But in the actual market, everybody moved around in the same place, but you could enter via the same gateway. And we'd shop. And I remember the butchery and the bakery, and I used to have lovely experiences of shopping with my grandmother. At some point later in my life, when my parents finally got to live together, and I went to the English market, it was just psychological. You don't go through the whites only entrance, and then you go through, you use the other entrance. And I went there with my mother, and I remember that distinct feeling of when I used to come regularly with my Oma, we'd always use the whites only entrance. But later on, when living with my father, I would go with my mother and use the non-white entrance. Going out with my granny, we'd use the red double-decker buses, the whites only buses. Later on, when I lived with my dad, I was about 9 years old, we then only used the non-white buses. So there was this parallel experience for me at one point in my life where I had to consciously make the shift between years living with my grandmother and then the switch when I lived with my father, um, to the point where my father insisted that we even have name changes because he wanted us to now reclassify as Indian. Because living with my grandmother, I lived under my birth certificate. I had a different name when I was born. I grew up Catholic. And when I was about 9, my dad decided, no, we must now reclassify as Indian and have Indian names. So I was fortunate in that I was able to choose my own name. So my name, Sobhna, was actually made up by myself.
Interesting. So, what's life like in South Africa?
I think I'm privileged to live in a very beautiful and peaceful part of the country. There's a lot of chaos around me, but I'm a very peaceful person. And so I'm able to, in many ways, distance or dissociate from a lot of chaos in my life. Um, I like, I should say, I love my own company. I like being alone. I enjoy quiet. I spend a lot of time outdoors and a lot of time, at my desk writing. Um, I live a lot in my creative space, but of course, very aware of what's going on in the country. I spent several years working in the editing environment, so I was in the middle of news and newspapering. But I try to stay in a very peaceful ambit and stay connected with news, but also constantly center myself and to not allow so much chaos and disruption to interfere with my equanimity and also my creative mood.
That's good. Uh, could you compare life during apartheid with life after apartheid?
I think a lot of what went on in poorer environments still continue today. I grew up very poor. My Oma was very poor. There was a time when my father could not even afford the 11 Rand 5 cents for rent because he was disinherited, because he married out of his class, out of his culture, out of his religion. We lived in a one bedroom, or one room, should I say, leaking roof with rats as big as cats. Um, I was living in a multicultural suburb, so I was very connected to all racial groups when I grew up. I lived in what is now known as the Warwick Avenue Triangle, and the government for years tried to dismantle that community by bringing in soldiers, by bringing in bulldozers, and that community stood steadfast. And then there was a time when eventually people were then moved to the townships, the colored townships and the black townships and the Indian townships. And so we were all moved apart and separated. Right now, I am living closer to those townships, the Indian townships and the black townships. And I think around me there is more prosperity. I think it's because the environment I live in, as opposed to growing up, I experienced more poverty, not just in terms of my household, but in terms of all the people around me. So I think even in the townships where I live, many people I know from the poorer areas have access to running water, we have access to satellite TV. But of course, there are people who live beyond that, who um, still struggle with the basic necessities, as I think they always have.
Okay, from what you said, I mean, it's a mixed grill. So, what will you talk about percentages? I mean,
Sorry?
what will you talk about percentages? I mean, those that are better off now, and those that are still worse off.
I think the latest stats in South Africa is that about a third of the population is under 15 years of age. So we have high youth unemployment and also education. For me, education has always been, the biggest factor in development, in moving forward. And I come from an educational background. I taught at a university. And I find that knowledge, information are the key things that can actually help one rise above one's circumstances, having an understanding of the world around us. And I think because of a large percentage of the population not having access to education, to maybe perhaps high school education or tertiary education, I think for me, poverty is about the lack of knowledge. And I think there's a lot of it in South Africa, lack of information. And so people are left behind, and it's large swathes of the population that live in a consciousness of this is the way it is. And so it's a constant struggle. I think I was fortunate in the fact that I fought for access to education. My parents were ready to marry me off when I was 12, but I fought for education. I went to university, and I made sure that I stood up for myself at every step of the way, and not succumbed to all the forces that try to box me in.
Now, what can you say about xenophobia in South Africa?
We read about that all the time, and I think not only in South Africa, but I think it's the world over. When we think of xenos, I think xenos simply means stranger, from the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's our human condition. We are afraid of things we do not know. How many people would open their door to a stranger? Not many. And I think it's this fear that drives us. The fear of the unknown, the fear of not knowing. And I don't think it's so much a people or a person that we're fighting against, or we disliking. I think it's the fear, not having the knowledge and the information, that makes us fight against or chase away, because we do not know, because we do not understand. And so when our fear takes over, we push and we shove. And I think that's one of, humans' big problem, the fear of not knowing and the fear of the unknown.
That's brilliant. Now, you're a writer.
I'd like to think that for now.
Now, what was the response of your parents?
Of
your parents, when you told them?
Parents?
Yeah, your parents.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. Now that's another volume to write about. I started writing when I was very young. I used to write in school and have my poetry and short stories put up on the wall, on the board every day. My parents were very distanced from my writing. They were not involved at all. I was a solitary writer. I'd write just to express my thoughts. I'd write stories from my imagination. I would create these fantasies and put them down on paper. The very first time my parents realized that I was writing was when I published And I had interviews published in the local newspapers, but they still didn't say a word. And people would say, "Oh, your parents are very proud of you." And I'd say, "They haven't said a word." So they were never involved in my creative, um, the creative side of me at all.
Until now?
Well, no, both my parents passed away
Oh,
the
I'm
past
sorry.
10 years. But when it was interesting, when my dad passed away, I found all the newspaper clippings in a
Okay,
file in his drawer.
okay.
Um, I was writing and collecting material, and one day, one of the South African writers came past my desk and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "Don't touch that." And I grabbed it from him and he said, "Let me read it." And I said, "I'm not writing for other people to read." And he ended up reading some of it and he said, "Take this to a publisher. I know somebody." And that started my writing career. I got my first two books published shortly after that, poetry books. And the one book was the finalist in the CNA Literary Award, 1991. And after that, I just went into a dry spell. I stopped writing for a long time. Um, Years later, I picked up the pen again and scribbled. And 2 years ago, during the first lockdown, I started dabbling in prose. And so my first foray into prose sparked a whole lot of memories, mostly about childhood and growing up in the Warwick Avenue Triangle and growing up and living under apartheid, and memories of my grandmother. And so I've started writing prose, and almost at the end of my first volume of short stories. So sadly, my parents didn't live to see me develop into the writer that I'm hoping to be.
You are hoping to be.
Well, yeah, I never considered myself to be a writer. It was just it was never a thought. It was never a dream, an ambition. It's never something I wrote down to say, when I grow up, I want to be a writer. No, it was nothing like that. It never occurred to me. There was never a word that popped into my head. But I think I'm writing more seriously now. I can see the difference in my writing when I was in my 20s. I mean, the poems that I've published um, were written in my late teens, and yeah, late teens and early 20s. So, this is one of them.
Okay.
And the other one, this one was a finalist for the CNA Literary Award. I had one recently. I've just been part of a book that was published last week. In fact, this was just uh, group writings that have been put together, and then I've been published in a range of books. I think my first joy was when I won in a BBC Arts in Africa poetry competition. And then I thought, oh yeah, I can write. I must continue writing, but never for a moment thought of myself as a writer. As I say, until now, I'm getting serious about writing prose, and I'm really enjoying it.
Now, you write both prose and poetry.
I'm writing both, yes.
Oh, okay, okay. Now, that brings me to another thing. There's a general saying that Africans are the best to write their own stories, not foreigners, as it is. What do you think of that?
We're saying Africans writing the best stories.
No, Africans, because of their experiences and so on, will be the best to write their own stories.
I think we have um, a way of really getting deep into our hearts and souls when we write. I think that's been my African experience. Um, Growing up, I was not exposed to African writers. And I only experienced African writers when I got to university. I mean, I grew up on the classics, Dickens and company. I lived on Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes when I grew up. Um, and I think our not just our depth of emotion and introspection, but I think our culture, the cauldron of cultures and rituals and the richness of the African experience, I think just bubbles out of the prose and the poetry that comes from Africa, because it is so diverse with so much content and so much fascination and so much information. I think that people find it. I think we ourselves find Africa so interesting.
Now, as a writer, what do you stand for?
What do I?
Stand for. What do you stand for?
Well, if I'm calling myself a writer now, I'd like to think that
Oh, you're a writer.
I'm a writer. Okay. I think writing to share information and knowledge, to express oneself, to encourage people. Writing as a way of healing, which I've shared workshops. I've run workshops, women's workshops on healing and personal expression. Writing to share culture and knowledge about people and showing the diversity of one's heritage and one's environments and one's community. And writing for inspiration. I think when we read other writers, there are certain words or expressions that resonate with us, and we draw inspiration, we find solace in writing. So I think writing has got has got much value and has different meanings for different people. And I think everybody's work resonates with someone somewhere in the world.
Would you think writing is a way of escape? Maybe from reality and whatever?
It can be. It can be. I think it just depends on the writer, how they write and their writing style. I think when one sits in a solitary space with one's thoughts, introspecting, one can journey to places that one perhaps could not have even imagined if one were sitting at the kitchen bench or walking in the garden or, reading a book or laying in bed. I think when one's mind is allowed to drift, one can create spaces and can create characters and can create scenarios that one perhaps wouldn't ordinarily create. When I write, I sometimes have no idea what I'm going to be putting on the page. And I can visualize a scene, something that I've not imagined before, and I'm immersed and I travel and I see colors, I see pictures, I hear voices, and I'm able then to put that down onto paper.
Okay. Now, you just posed an interesting thought to my brain. Now, you know that some writings are predictive. You know, I mean, about what's going to happen to the society. You know that? That is some
Yes, yes,
writings. That some writings are predictive of what's going to happen to
right,
the society. I mean, how
right.
come? How do writers develop that kind of idea?
I think it's all to do with the imagination.
Okay.
You know, when people talk about what's going to be happening in, I don't know, what, 2052,
Mm-hmm.
you know, scientists do it. Um, people who are um, creative artists do it in their art. Would say things like, "Wow, you know, what was in that person's mind that they could even think up something like this?" I think it's in the imagination of the artist.
Mm.
There are people predicting viruses decades ago, and we thought, "Oh, it wouldn't happen to us." So I think the creative mind is quite a beautiful thing, because if we allow that mind to experience those thoughts, those feelings, I think we can create so much more. I mean, there was a time when we thought going into space, what a laugh. But look what happened. So I think it's in a similar way. I think writers' minds can create those experiences, those fantasies about what could happen in the future. You know, they can create these worlds in their imagination.
Hmm. Now, what do you think about self-publishing?
You know, it's something that I've not considered. I know of many people who do self-publish, some very successfully. I think on the one hand, it's a good way to get your work out there. Um, but there are those who say, if you self-publish, well, you're not really considered a writer. You're not considered a published writer. So there's this, I think there's this tussle that one has got to come to terms with. Do I just want to write and get my writing out there? Or do I want to wait to be recognized through a publisher?
Mm.
I've got no work on the internet. I don't post. I might have submitted one or two pieces, but I don't post stuff on forums, and I don't share my work online, and I'm not out there.
All right. Uh, could you share with us uh, your happiest day so far?
My
Happiest day so far.
my happiest. I think I'm a happy person. Um, as I said earlier, my happiest memories were growing up with my French grandmother. And I think that's where my imagination really started to take hold of me and get my creative energies going. Every day, I give thanks for joy. I give thanks for what happens in my day. You know, whether it's having to write, whether it's having to have a conversation with somebody, whether it's having to counsel someone, sharing an idea, talking with people in the shops, you know, helping somebody choose between green grapes or black grapes, and striking a conversation with a total stranger in the supermarket. I find that if I'm able to achieve something every day, and in fact, learn something new, even if it's a new word, at the end of the day, I have so much to be grateful for. And I generally have a very happy disposition. And I feel joy and peaceful and quiet, because I think it's a lot about getting the chaos out of my head.
Now, this last question, you are not obliged to answer, right? You are
Sorry, you're
not.
not?
You are not obliged to answer my
Okay.
last question.
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us your most embarrassing moment?
I'm sure there've been quite a few. I tell you the ones that oh, that I think the ones that have stayed with me. After I published my first book, I was at I think it was at an arts fair, and I wanted to sing, and saw myself as a singer, and I sang the song, and I lost the last note, and I coughed, and I thought, oh no, I'll never go on stage and sing again. And after I left, I went into one of the classrooms, and there was a group of people there, and they came towards me with copies of my book and asked me for an autograph. And of course, the first thing I did was to make a U-turn and get out of there because I didn't know how to respond to people asking me for an autograph. It was so new, I was so inexperienced, and yeah, I think I felt a total fool. Somebody came to call me and said, no, 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 you've got to speak to them and sign their books. So that was the first one. And the second one was after I had completed my master's degree. Um, I was invited by a branch of the ANC Women's League to speak at one of their meetings. My thesis was on dance and sexual politics, and it related to um, media and how women are perceived in the media. And so I got there, and of course I carried my published thesis, and I was confronted by this room of men and women, and I was totally overwhelmed. And the first thing I did was open this thesis and I started reading. And the next thing I got a nudge from my best friend, and she said, stop reading, speak to your audience. And after I left there, I was really embarrassed. I later got into communications. And of course, I know when you're dealing with an audience, you need to connect with them. Don't read from a text. So I learned a valuable lesson from that. And I still feel embarrassed when I think about those experiences.
Yeah, I told you you read a poem for us, but because of the lateness in
That's
getting
fine.
contact, possibly you forward it, then we'll publish it, right? Okay. It's been nice talking to you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.